Hi, my name is Gray Miller, and today I'm presenting on Chapter 5 of Harvard Business Review's 10 Must Reads, and it is entitled Why Should Anyone Be Led by You by Gareth Jones and Robert Goffey. And I would also like to say rest in peace to Gareth Jones. He passed away sadly in 2021. So, leadership assumptions. So, basically, these guys created these leadership assumptions, and they wanted to, I guess, signify that these good leadership isn't based on results, it's more about your relationships with the people. And so leadership qualities continue to confuse businesses for all of human history. So the 18th century beliefs, when people sort of started, coming into their own and thinking more so about how people operate, was in a time called the Enlightenment. And so this philosopher Voltaire claimed that through the application of reason alone, man can sort of control their destiny. Now, in the 19th century, Sigmund Freud started his research and work into the human subconscious, and basically he theorized that by understanding your own subconscious, you can become a better leader. So, do leaders simply have to be energetic, authoritative, and powerful? According to Jones and Goffey, that would be no. A leader who is simply just dictating orders and kind of just telling his people what to do without trying to relate to them in any way is not going to be a good leader. They're going to be somebody that the people do not like to work with. And from this article, I found that one of the most important things about leadership is being able to, one, relate to your employees, but also make them want to follow you. If you don't have qualities that make people want to follow you, they won't do good work for you. And so their whole idea focuses on these four unexpected qualities of leaders, which the first one being vulnerability, and then being a sensor, and then this idea of tough empathy and recognizing their own unique capabilities. And so I'll go into detail about each of them right now. All right, so first up is vulnerability. So great leadership is tied heavily to relation in the sense that people aren't going to follow and put in good work for someone that they can't relate to because at its core, humanity is about relating to others and finding things that are similar because, this isn't really leadership, but all good friendships are started off with, oh, you do that too. So, it's this idea that we're just constantly looking for ways to relate to people and get to know them through ways that we're just a little bit like them. And so this idea of vulnerability, showing your subordinates that you are human is a good way to create equality with your workers because then they sort of start to perceive you as a human, which is good because you don't want to be this sort of, all-encompassing higher power for your workers or else they can't relate to you at all. And so one example that I found in this article is of Richard Branson, who's the founder of Virgin Airlines, big billionaire guy and whatnot. So he's pretty good at effectively communicating his vulnerability. So in a lot of his interviews in public, he can kind of come off a little bit as a little nervous and he kind of, stumbles over words sometimes. But in the end of the interview, he's always speaking very succinctly and thoroughly. And, he does portray that confidence, but I think he's also good about, he letting people know that he does have a little bit of anxiety about talking to people, which is good because it humanizes. And so, without showing weaknesses, followers will inherently invent them for you. And this is the idea that you want to show your weaknesses instead of trying to hide them because um, people are sort of inclined to read into things. And if leaders aren't good at showing their own weaknesses, then followers will come up with them. But by doing this, you want to practice a little bit of selective weakness, which is basically just choosing when, how, and what you want to portray as your weakness because you don't want, a CEO of an accounting firm 20 years down the line to come out and say, hey, I don't really understand, the cash flow system and stuff like that because then it's like, okay, well, that's more than a weakness. That's you not knowing how to do your job. You want to just sort of, like Richard Branson does, portraying a little bit of anxiety, something that humanizes you but doesn't make you look incompetent in your work, you know? You don't want to expose something that will be seen as a fatal flaw because then that jeopardizes your credibility as a leader and just your job credibility in general. All right, so secondly is becoming a sensor. And so inspirational leaders rely heavily on their instincts to know when to reveal a weakness or a difference. And these are what Goffey and Jones referred to as situation sensors. And so essentially what that is being able to collect and interpret soft data in terms of your interactions with people. And so you have to trust these instincts about what you read about people and what you know about the people that you work with because by sensing what's going on, maybe not before it happens, but as it's happening, is a pretty great way to lead and relate to your people. So the example I have listed here is about Ray Van Schaik. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He was the chairman of Heineken in the early 1990s. And so his genius sort of laid in his ability to read signals he received from colleagues and from specifically Freddie Heineken, the third generation family member who was quote unquote always there without being there. So some senior managers spent a lot of time second guessing the major shareholder, but Van Schaik developed an ability to kind of know what Heineken wanted, and that wasn't an automatic thing. Like he met him and he just knew what he wanted. He served on the board, but over his time serving with that board, he developed a not maybe a third sense, I guess, quote unquote, with figuring out what Heineken wanted just based on his personality and looking at his past business dealings and things like that. Um, but even though they had very different personalities, Van Schaik continued to evolve his relationship with Heineken and could figure out exactly what he wanted without knowing. Now, this quality does come with a warning though, because sensing too far can cause projection, and so you have to be able to differentiate between the noise, and that is kind of what makes a good leader, because if you can't differentiate between that noise, you kind of just end up with a little bit of anxiety and sort of um, the inability to make decisions because you're constantly just, oh, but I feel like this could be happening. You gotta suss out the vibe and figure out, hey, this is just my anxiety talking, and then, hey, this is actually something that I'm sensing and that could be good for the business. All right, now they have this idea of tough empathy. So real leaders are inherently open to others' emotions, and in today's business environment specifically, people are constantly preaching about how leaders should be open emotionally and connected with their employees' emotions, but um, these guys, Goffey and Jones, they presented this idea of tough empathy, which is sort of giving people what they need and not what they want necessarily, just because you want to be able to adapt to the people that you're working with. And so Alan Levy, the former CEO of Polygram, so he could kind of always come off as a little bit aloof and a heavy intellectual, but Levy was very good at being able to close the distance between himself and his followers. So specifically on one occasion, he helped some junior record executives in Australia choose singles off their albums, and that's a pretty big part of the music business just because that can make or break your album. You want to get that good interaction and listening up with the singles, so you have to choose things that are gonna chart well and get people listening to your album, get the anticipation flowing. And so a lot of the record executives at that point were younger people, and so Levy sat down with them and he displayed his passion. He called them bloody idiots and you don't know what the hell you're talking about. We have to have a dance track first, stuff like that. And while it may come off as mean to some people, he was sort of just relating to them in that sense that it was a more casual office and they were talking to each other like that. If he had come up in there and just been all about business, then they probably wouldn't have listened to him as much. And so this idea of tough empathy is being able to recognize exactly what the environment of your office is, what the environment of the people are, how they interact with each other, and tapping into that, and then being able to express yourself in a way that relates to the people you're working with. And so, lastly, tough empathy is truly unlocked by people who care about the work, just because you're going to be able to express yourself more passionately and more authentically if you actually care about what you're doing. If a leader doesn't care about what they're doing, they're not going to be able to give as much tough empathy just because they don't truly care about um, what they're talking about. All right, lastly is the unique capabilities, and Goffey and Jones titled this in their article Dare to be Different. And so basically, good leaders are able to recognize, and this does take time to figure out who you are and what you struggle with and what separates you also from other leaders. And so this one is, they've said, is the most important of the four qualities just because it's a little more inherent and you want to be able to figure out what's unique about you, how you lead differently, how you work differently, how you relate to people differently. And so like the slide says, many people struggle to first recognize their unique capabilities, but also to display them once they do. So this is about figuring out what makes you different, but then also being able to convey it. So an example is John Harvey Jones, and I put physical on the slide. And so this is just because he was the CEO of ICI, which was once the largest manufacturing company in the UK. And John Harvey Jones always had a certain look about him. He had long hair, he had a mustache, and he had a loud tie. And so he created sort of a silhouette of himself. So no matter who saw it, they'd say, "Oh, that's John Harvey Jones." So that's a physical separation from other leaders. You know, John Harvey Jones gave himself a recognizable image. Then there's a different way to do it. So I put Richard Service, the how he conveyed himself. And so he was the managing director of UK-based Pearl Insurance, my bad. And he always walked the floor and overtook people. You know, he was walking with a sense of urgency, and so he used his own pace to set that sense of urgency within his whole company. And lastly, too much difference can be disastrous for leaders just because you can kind of ostracize yourself by making yourself seem way too different, you know? If you if you are a heavy intellectual and you're only speaking in, you know, verbose language and long sentences to, you know, your workers, they're not going to be able to relate to you at all just because you seem so much more intellectual than them and just so far off. And so this happened to Robert Horton's tenure when he was the chairman and CEO of BP in the early 90s. So his conspicuous display of his considerable and daunting intelligence sometimes led others to see him as arrogant, just because, you know, like I said, you seem so smart, you seem so separated from the pack that people cannot relate to you at all. All right, so in conclusion, these four qualities must become a natural part of any leader's personality because the biggest thing about this is being authentic to yourself because employees can sense inauthenticity really fast. And so the challenge facing prospective leaders is for them to be themselves, but with more skill. And that can be done by making yourself increasingly aware of the four leadership qualities we described and by manipulating these qualities to sort of fit a personal style that works for you. It's not a, you know, one size fits all. You have to take these as a little bit of a template and then expand them into your personality without making it seem inauthentic. So when he was running the R&D division at Glaxo, Richard Sykes gave a year-end review to the company's top scientists, and at the end of that presentation, a researcher asked him about one of the company's new compounds. And so they got into a heavy debate of it, and then the researcher said, Dr. Sykes, you have still failed to understand the structure of the new compound. And it's said in the article that you can sort of feel like the tension in the room at that point. And so Sykes yells, "All right, lad, you know, let's look at your notes." And so the story kind of provides the ideal framework for discussing the four leadership qualities just because Sykes' irritability could seem inappropriate or like a weakness, but in the context of that story, his temperature, his temper demonstrated his belief in a discussion about science. And so it sort of cemented his credibility as a leader just because he was willing to talk to his workers and his scientists at the level that they are. And, you know, it showed that he was passionate about what he was doing. He was showing his authenticity and how he cared for the work that they were doing. Yeah, so thanks for listening, guys, and have a good one.